Hello, everyone. Again, this is Ethan Shapiro, the climate change realtor, founder and manager of the most innovative real estate corporation ever conceptualized, here for another episode of Changing the Climate. I am very excited to have my guest, Suzanne Jones. Suzanne is the executive director of EcoCycle, a nonprofit organization based in Boulder dedicated to building zero waste communities. She served on the Boulder City Council from 2011 to 2019, spending the last 4 years as the mayor of our city of Boulder. And that is what Suzanne has just been up to for the last decade. So Suzanne, thank you so much for being here today.
It is all my pleasure.
Yeah, the pleasure is
Thank you for
mutual.
having these conversations about climate. I think it's such an important issue.
Thank you. I love having these conversations about climate. And to be honest, I wasn't very interested in climate. I went to business school, but the more I talk about it, the more I have to learn. And I'm addicted to growing and becoming more intelligent and learning. So that's what makes this show really fun for me personally. But
Well, good on you.
I always love to start the show by getting some background on my guest, if you wouldn't mind.
Absolutely. Ask away. What do you want to know?
Fair enough. I always basically just say, how'd you get to where you are today? I'm curious what led you to do the master's at the University of Michigan on resource and policy management. How did you get into resource management, and what made you get into politics and all that kind of stuff?
Great question. Well, it all started with me falling in love with a mountain. And I grew up actually in inner city, Kansas City, but my parents were teachers. And so they would bring us out to the west slope of Colorado every summer. And that's where, out near Carbondale, and fell in love with Mount Sopris, which turns out is protected wilderness, and knew that I wanted to be involved with trying to preserve the planet for all of us, but also for itself, because it's so amazing. Mm-hmm. And so that led me, and I should say I have a twin sister, Elise Jones. She's a Boulder County Commissioner. And we both went to undergrad together at Cornell and studied natural resource and environmental science. And that was a blast. Got to study all the ologies and how nature works. And then I sampled a few different career paths, working for the Park Service, teaching Outward Bound, doing environmental education. And then I decided, if we're going to save the planet, I need to go and do policy. So I ended up going to the University of Michigan. Back then it was called the School of Natural Resources. And they have a great program. And it's all about, how do you begin to change the levers of power in order to set up a system, to transform the system, to better protect the planet, to get all those businesses out there, to start businesses that are actually sustainable both economically and environmentally. So that's what I did. And then that led me to go to Washington, D.C., which is where a lot of environmental policy is made. And so
what did you do there?
I worked for the National Wildlife Federation. Well, first I worked on Capitol Hill for a year for the House of Representatives for that, what was then the Fisheries and Wildlife Subcommittee. And that caused National Wildlife Federation to hire me to work on endangered species and the Endangered Species Act. And I did that for a few years, and it was fascinating. It was wonderful to see how it works and how it doesn't. And just about when Newt Gingrich took over the House of Representatives, that's probably before your time, Ethan, but it's when things lurched more conservative and the parties quit working together. I decided it's time to get back to the mountains. So I came back to Colorado, and I worked for 16 years for the Wilderness Society. And I got to protect our public lands in Colorado and Utah and work on forest management and wildlife habitat preservation and climate change.
Yes. So when you say work on protecting our land, what would that look like on like a day-to-day basis for 16 years?
I worked in collaboration with lots of other groups like Sierra Club and local forest protection groups, and we would work to work on forest plans and other administrative documents that are the management plans for public lands, but also to pass legislation in Congress to designate lands as wilderness or to expand national parks or to establish national conservation areas. And so that was just to make sure that there's plenty of wild places left that are intact and doing all the great things that the environment does for us naturally, right? Providing
Right.
clean air,
Mm-hmm.
clean water, and also for us to enjoy for generations to come. So that was a great labor of love.
Yeah, well,
Um,
thank you for that. And I guess my first question for you is, why do you think conservation is so important? And then my like kind of second question off of that is, why do you think most people don't even think about or realize how much we're truly failing at this? We haven't struck a balance between the natural world and the human world, if there is that split.
well, so why we should care
Yes.
is we have this one amazing blue-green planet
Hmm.
in the whole universe, right? We're the
Yeah.
only planet like it. And it's amazing when you think about things like monarch butterflies that migrate around the world, these little butterflies. And, how does that happen? And all of the fact that, nothing is wasted in nature. It's this amazing cycle. And for all those reasons, it is our one planet. And we depend on it for our well-being. We depend on it spiritually because we all love to go to the outdoors. Colorado knows this. Boulder knows this. We
Hmm.
need it more than ever. But also just we need it for the clean air. We need it for clean water. It's where our food is from. It's where our medicine comes from. It's where all of the aspects of our life, start from is, natural resources, right? To make our clothes and our cars and our houses and all that. Anyhow, it stems from this. And we need to be in balance with that because right now we aren't. And eventually we're going to run out of resources, right?
Quickly.
Yeah. And if everybody adopts the lifestyle of the United States, and we consume a lot,
Hmm.
and frankly, Boulder consumes a lot. If everybody adopts that lifestyle, we're going to need 5 planets to provide all of those resources so everybody can have a car or 2 cars, etc. And so that's not sustainable. We need to get that under control. And so we need to care because it's the right thing to do. We need to care because our future depends on it.
Yeah, and you say need in the sense that it could be life or death potentially. Not necessarily in the next 10, 20 years, but you're talking about the next few centuries of human life. If everyone were to try and live this American lifestyle, we would basically suck the planet dry of all resources and then turn into a
Correct.
desert.
And we're already seeing the impacts of climate change because the other aspect of that is we pollute a lot as human beings and we could do much better. And you know what? When there is pollution, it's waste, right? It's an
Hmm.
inefficiency in the system. And you as a business person should know that nature doesn't have waste, right? Nothing, everything is used in nature. It just cycles through. When we produced air pollution that begins to warm our climate, we are out of whack with systems. So we're already seeing the impacts of climate change, right?
Yeah.
Even if you've only lived here 10 years, the summers are warmer, there's less snow, there's bigger storms, but it doesn't last as long. You look outside right now and it's dry, even though it snowed a little bit, earlier in the week, and we're having more wildfires, they're bigger, etc. So it's going to be during our lifetimes, we're going to see drastic change. And we're going to bring, not only are we going to fundamentally change our quality of life and all the inequities that come with not having enough resources to go around, but we're going to take down a lot of life forms with us. We're going to see a lot of extinctions during our lifetimes, let alone 100 years from now. And so we really need to get to work to address that, which is why I now work for EcoCycle.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you asked me how I got into politics. Well, I got into politics and EcoCycle at the same time for the same reasons.
Hmm.
And I was working at the Wilderness Society and trying to deal with Congress, and we were getting no national leadership on really important issues like climate. And I was like,
Why? Why?
well, because some powerful entities are making money from the status quo, the oil and gas industry, big corporations that are all
Big
about getting
pharma.
as many, yeah, and sell the companies that want to sell us lots of stuff, right? That's incongruous with this this notion of getting more in balance and using less. So those two different things are at odds. And
I have a
so,
question.
yep.
Do we need to combat these people, or is there some way that we can get them onto the side of everyone? Because I have this belief that like you can be friends with anyone, and everyone's like, oh, you can't be friends with everyone, and there are these big powerful entities that are trying to make short-term profits. But surely at the heads of every organization is a human being who I could get on a podcast and have a conversation with and see the way they think and how they feel. I don't know. It, I, it's just troubling.
Yes, I think ultimately, um, yes, you should be able to talk to every human being. And
Corporations are people
uh,
working together.
well, but the system, we have to change the system. We live in a capitalist society, and it's based on, you get to make as much as you can, and make money doing it, right? And what society has to do is put sideboards on capitalism and say, yeah, but you can't make money polluting. You can't,
Right.
and so we have the Clean Air Act. But, it was passed by politicians who depend on money from the corporations. So it's not as strong as it should be. And the same thing, you're not supposed to pollute the water. And, oh, by the way, you're supposed to pay your workers a decent wage, and so on. And so we, the society, and us as activists and participants in democracy, need to keep changing that system so that as people do their capitalist things, as businesses happen, they the oars are in the water going towards the common good. Okay. And
Uh-huh.
so your business needs to produce public benefit and not have all these externalities like pollution or income equality or those sorts
Sure.
of things, or toxic products, right? You need to be, and so part of it is we need to change the system so that um, the businesses aren't allowed to do the bad stuff, and they are incentivized and motivated to do good things and make
So
money doing it.
correct. So what they taught at Leeds was right now we're on this system where we prioritize shareholder value. But what they taught at Leeds was to prioritize stakeholder value. And I do believe that the economy is based on not just deriving profit, but creating value for as many people as possible. And this idea of a stakeholder is someone who has a vested interest in the company. So I see like an oil company that, yes, they provide heat and energy and power to us, but if they're polluting the air, which is eventually going to kill us, that's going to hurt their stakeholders because we all have a stake in the environment, right?
Exactly. And I think setting up corporations so that they are geared towards the public good, like B corporations, that is a form of a
Right.
corporation that has encapsulated that concept that you're talking about.
Sure. We learned
So
about that as well.
So one of the things that we're doing at EcoCycle, and how I got into working for EcoCycle is to address consumer emissions. And one of the ways that we get at climate change here is addressing all the stuff that we use, buy, and then throw away, and
Yeah.
all the emissions that go with that. And keep that under control, we can really begin to address climate change. And a lot of people don't think about that. Zero waste is what we call recycling, composting, waste reduction, that whole suite of things we can do to minimize our impacts. It has a huge climate footprint, but very often zero waste isn't even at the climate table, right? We
Mm-hmm.
think about, well, where does our electricity come from? Where does our heating come from in our buildings? And where's the fuel for our cars? Those are the big ones that we think about, and those are very important. But one of the things that people don't often understand is that 42% of the emissions in the United States come from making, transporting, using, and disposing of our stuff and our food.
100%.
Yeah. So it's a
I was
huge part.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was thinking about before we got on this podcast, I was going to make a list of all the things that I consume and use every day, like toothpaste, I have facial cream, I have facial sanitizer or whatever, I have shampoo, I have soap, I have sriracha bottles, I have packages that I eat with my grapes. I talked about protein powder that I get every month, and it's all this plastic packaging that I'm creating, or not even creating, I'm adding into the environment. And I'm also curious just what recycling actually is, because I'm kind of skeptical that we even actually recycle
Ah,
things.
well, let's talk about that. But also, just think, when you think about your stuff, you're thinking about this, your
Mm-hmm.
clothes, your
Yep.
car, all of that, almost all of that comes from other places. So whoever made your iPhone, it it counts against their emissions, right? The making of this phone, but they're making it for you and you're using it. And so it's really interesting. One of the reasons why it's hard to address consumption emissions is that they're not counted for in greenhouse accounting very well, because normally when we figure out what your climate footprint is, it's again, your electricity, your heating, and your fuel. And, within Boulder, for example. But the emissions that were used to make all the stuff that gets transported in, it's complicated to capture, so it's not captured. So let me tell you the ways that recycling and composting and other zero waste solutions affect climate change.
And
And
can
then
we make sure we know what all those terms mean as well, to make sure everyone understands?
okay, so recycling.
Yeah.
Um, so that's where we take materials, and there's a suite of things that we put in our single stream bin that are commonly recycled. So glass, paper, cardboard, aluminum cans, um, some kinds of plastics. Those are all materials that we recycle. Okay. And when you think about it, a ton of energy is saved when we use those materials, like take an aluminum can and use it to make a new aluminum can. We save a whole lot of energy. So for aluminum, and it's one of the most important when it comes to this percentage, 90%, over 90% of the energy is saved by making a new can out of an old can, as opposed to going and mining more bauxite ore in the rainforest, smelting it, turning it into aluminum, and making it into a can.
Wow.
So a
Okay.
huge savings if you just recycle it. And just so you know, aluminum is worth so much money and has such a big climate footprint. Never throw away another aluminum can, okay? It should
What's
always be recycled.
what's the deal with that other 10%? Is that what it took to originally make the can?
Well, it just means it still takes energy to make a new aluminum
Okay,
can,
fair enough. Yeah.
okay? And so you save by recycling materials and making new stuff out of old stuff, you save a huge amount of energy, and energy is fossil fuels, and fossil fuels equals climate change. So there's a major footprint that comes from just recycling, okay? There's other ways though. Composting is another way that's really important with the climate
Smelly
footprint.
way.
Yeah, okay, so when organic matter, okay, organic waste, and that's
Banana
anything
peels.
that used to be alive, okay? Um, it you put that in the landfill, right? It gets covered with stuff, so it's anaerobic, no oxygen, and I'll just say for parlance terms, it rots and it produces methane.
Oh.
Okay, so methane is a horrible
Oh yeah.
greenhouse gas. It's very potent. It's much more potent than carbon dioxide in the short term. It's 84 times more potent in over a 20-year period than carbon dioxide. It just breaks down quickly. So it's a short-term pollutant with huge impacts. Okay, so you don't want to be sticking organic matter in a landfill where it produces methane. That's bad. And here's the other kicker. If you take organic waste and you compost it, and it breaks down in the presence of oxygen, so that's the difference. And most of you have probably seen a compost pile, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it creates this wonderful mixture of carbon and nitrogen and microbes that are breaking it down. And if you take that and you apply it to soils, and keep in mind we have totally different soils, and they could very much use refurbishment. So when you apply compost to soils, it makes them much more healthy, and it greatly enhances the soil's ability in the plants that grow there to sequester carbon out of the atmosphere. So you all remember photosynthesis from high school biology,
Mm-hmm.
which is plants. They suck carbon dioxide and they use it with the sun and water to grow, and they put out
Glucose.
oxygen.
Yeah.
Yes. And so by enhancing our soils, plants can suck out so much more carbon dioxide,
Become
um,
healthier and take CO2 out of the atmosphere.
and they store it in the soil. That's the thing. People think it's all in the tree is storing soil in the trunk, but it's storing, there's 3 times more carbon that is sucked out of the atmosphere and stored in soil. So healthy soil becomes this huge carbon sink. So we look at, how do we stop greenhouse gas emissions by, doing things like electric cars, but also not putting organics in landfills. We also can take that and transform it into climate solution, which is let's supercharge our natural mechanisms that help regulate the planet, like
Mm-hmm.
photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So zero waste between recycling, which saves energy, and composting, which prevents methane and becomes a climate solution. Doing these zero waste solutions has a huge climate footprint that we should be capitalizing on and using to really address this existential crisis of climate change.
Yeah. So when you say zero waste, it's the idea is as close to zero waste as possible. So that would mean prioritizing consuming materials that can then be reused, which would mean less plastics, more stuff like aluminum. Is that the idea? Because I look around the room and I see so much plastic, and I never did before until I started thinking about these things. But now I see how essential. And then I know on a couple episodes ago, we had Debbie was talking about how basically like most of the vehicle is made out of different things from those fossil fuels. So fossil fuels would not be part of this zero waste idea. Am I right?
Right. And think of it as right now we have this linear consumption model. It's called make, take, waste, right? Take, make, waste. So we
Mm-hmm.
take things out of the ground or we cut down trees, we take them, we make them into products, we consume them, and then we waste them. We bury them in the ground, right? Landfills are just a way to bury stuff in the ground, including stuff that's worth a lot of money, like a lot of money, like aluminum.
Gross.
And yeah. So instead of this linear model, we need to get to a circular model. And a lot of people talk about this circular economy where resources are cycled endlessly and not buried in the ground
And that's
and
how
not
Earth works.
burnt.
That's how
Yes.
Earth without humans works naturally. We've
Yes,
created this
exactly.
own thing that is detrimental. Yeah.
It's a one-way street that ends in a dead end. And instead, we need to get back to that. And so we have that in place in pieces.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, around here in our region in Boulder County, we have a closed loop for glass. So you drink a beer and you put it in the recycle bin and it comes to the Boulder County Recycling Center and we sort it and we pass it on to Momentum Recycling that further sorts and separates all the different pieces of glass into different types and sells it to Rocky Mountain Bottling Company that makes it back into a bottle. And then it's back on the shelf. Presumably, the estimate is within 2 months to make another 6-pack of beer. So, or whatever, kombucha or whatever you drink. So that's an example of a closed loop where the materials are cycled. And we want to get that in place for many more materials.
As much as possible is
As
the
much as
idea.
possible. The other piece, though, of this that I need to mention is it goes reduce, reuse, recycle. Recycling is the last thing, not the first thing. The first thing we need to do is consume less. Do I need to buy another jacket this winter? Can I just buy a used one? Or better yet, use the one from last year? Well, those sorts of choices. Or can I go buy in bulk packaging altogether? Can I take my reusable mug to the coffee store instead of having them give me a cup that I use for 2 minutes or however long it takes me to drink coffee and then I throw it out? Those sorts of reduced choices. And then we have the reuse paradigm is once we have made something, how do we get the most out of it and have it reused? And that's where all the sharing economy comes into place, thrifting, reusing. This is a form of reuse, and so on. And we can do it at much larger scales, but that's that part. And then recycling is when something is done with its useful life, how do we take the parts and make them into new products? Okay,
Gotcha.
and then end up sending as little as possible to the landfill or into the air as emissions or the water as pollution.
So there's a bell going off in the inner capitalist in me. I want to sell people as many things as possible to get as much profit for my company as possible. So there's this mixed incentive here of what's good for the community versus what's good for business. Businesses want people to consume, and we want to live sustainably with the earth. And this is the society we are realistically in right now. So how can we pioneer such a drastic change? How can we incentivize businesses to want to live sustainably or as circularly in this system? Do you have any responses to that?
Yeah, there's, I think, several ways to look at it. And one is, as consumers, we make lots of choices every day, and that adds up. So I think
Huge.
that's important, is to think about your choices and help others think about their choices and to make better choices. So that's one part of it, but it shouldn't be all up to me to try to save the planet by which thing I buy at the store. We need to also change the system. And so
Okay.
part of it is having the producers of stuff take more responsibility for what they're putting out there. It's a concept called extended producer responsibility, or EPR. And it's a concept that has taken hold in Europe, where you put your Coca-Cola, you put out drinks in bottles. When people are done with their drink, you take the bottle back. And either you make a new bottle out of the old bottle, or maybe you start thinking about reusables or find a better system. But you're responsible for the bottle, not the consumer. And how do we change that? And if we change the playing field so that applies to all businesses, then it becomes a race to the top. How do you, as a business person, design your product as a service rather than a thing? Or if you produce things, then how do you make them in a way that they are easily reusable or recyclable? But design your business such that you're taking full responsibility for the whole life cycle of your product. And if we change the rules so that was required, then we are incentivizing businesses to be as good as they can be, as opposed to who can do something as cheapest and, with lots of waste.
So back in like the 1920s, when you'd buy a Coca-Cola, it would come in a glass bottle. Is that right? And in the last 100 years, most of the time you see a Coca-Cola bottle, it's in a piece of plastic. And I'm assuming, first off, number one, the plastic is not it cannot really be recycled. Is that correct? Or it can be recycled once or twice versus glass, which can be recycled multiple times?
Generally speaking, yes, it depends on what kind of plastic. Yes, glass can be recycled numerous times. But it's not necessarily totally benign. Glass weighs a lot. So if you're transporting lots of bottles, it takes a lot of fossil fuels to transport heavy bottles as opposed to lighter bottles. So it's not that simple. But the point that I think you were making is, in the 20s, you would drink a Coke out of a bottle and give the bottle back, right?
Well, yeah, okay.
Well, okay, and there are states that have bottle deposit bills, for example, where regardless of whether it's glass or plastic or whatever, you get a 10 cents deposit back when you give it back.
Incentive.
And that is a form of extended producer responsibility, because then the companies take the bottles back and they've got to do stuff with them, or they get recycled. But it's the companies become responsibility. It's embedded into the system that they have to take them back.
So that's the solution then. Because what I was getting at is that if the plastic bottle
Well, it's
is,
one of the solutions.
sorry, it's the connection. It's if the plastic bottle costs half a cent and it costs 1.5 cents to use a glass bottle, how can we effectively incentivize companies to use glass instead of plastic? And I think you're saying the answer is through government, like incentives in some way, something like that.
Or restrictions. I mean, people don't like the mandate word, but on the other hand, why can't we tell companies, hey, guess what? You can't pollute. You can't
Right.
put
Right.
carbon dioxide emissions into the air. And
Or into the ocean with plastic is what it
exactly.
is.
What if we say you can't do that? Then suddenly all the bright young people like you will be like, oh, well, let's design the system so it does this instead. Since I'm not allowed to do it this way, I'll do it this way, and it'll be better for the planet. And oh, by the way, people are going to want to drink my product because I'll say, hey, my brand is all about doing right by the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And oh, by
Fair
the way,
enough.
maybe you should be making a healthy drink as opposed to an unhealthy drink, and that helps in lots of other ways too. So I think that's part of the answer, is to change the system to move businesses towards doing the right thing. And when you have to do the right thing, or the right thing is the cost-effective thing, it makes the system work, and it builds circularity. And I do think that, take companies like Patagonia.
I
They
was going
do
to bring them up.
produce stuff, but they are constantly figuring out how to produce it in a way that is much more circular. And they do it by their
The
supply
reuse.
chain.
They
Part
focus
of
on the
it's,
reuse part. You want to
yes.
keep using their products, not throw it out.
And they're almost getting to the point where you, in some ways, are almost leasing your jacket, right? You buy it, you wear it for a few years or until you wear it out. And they say, we'll take it back and use that for you to buy your new one, and
That's amazing.
we'll recycle it. And they also care about their supply chain. Where did the wool come from, the wool sweater, and how do we support farmers in the countries that grow sheep to do it in a sustainable way? And you pay a bit more for Patagonia, but of course they also make good products, and they give back 1% for the planet. There's all kinds of reasons why you would want to be a part of that brand. Plus they produce good stuff in a way that's more circular. And so imagine if we required, I mean, the good companies are figuring it out. What if we made all the rest of them figure it out?
Yeah.
And that's, incentives, mandates. At some point, you just say, you can't pollute, right?
Right.
And
yeah. No, so no, I love this because I'm always grappling with the top down versus bottom up approach on this show. I'm trying to figure out, is it government, is it people, or is it businesses? And I'm really happy to have you because you're giving me a very strong case for the government. But my problem with creating restrictions and stuff, and then as far as more right-wing conservative people, the government is very ineffective at a lot of the stuff that it does, and people want to have this free market. And I'm not saying we can't have a free market with reasonable restrictions, like don't destroy the planet, but the government is so testy, and you can see it can drive people crazy, and then they put in a regulation, and then the other side just completely tries to fight it until it doesn't work. And I think this is a good transition perhaps to talk about what inspired you to serve on the city council, and what kind of like inactions you've put in on the local level, as far as, I don't know, just politics in general.
well, so one thing I'll just say is, when you say the government,
Mm-hmm.
at the local level, the government is us.
That's fair.
Okay.
That's fair.
And I was just a citizen who cared about climate, and a citizen activist, I guess. And so people said, hey, why don't you run? And so I did. And so I could be a part of the decision making, but I'm just a citizen of the community like everybody else. And here in Boulder, people are pretty informed and activated. And so city council meetings are, you get a lot of public input. A lot of people are engaged. And so it's
As
a
you should.
matter, yes. So I just, when we say the government, we are the government, and we decide for our community what makes sense. And so
I
that was
love
what
that.
was so much fun about I mean, it was hard because nobody in Boulder agrees,
It's an
but
impossible job, the
it was
government.
really fun to be in the middle going, okay, let's problem solve together and let's figure this out. And it was also fun because our community really cares about the environment and expects city council to lead. So there was a lot
Hmm.
of political license to not to try progressive things and to see what we could do, but there was almost an imperative. And so being on city council, we were trying to figure out how do we as a city reduce our emissions? How do we get really creative with businesses to have them help us figure it out? And we, this town is filled with startups, a lot of energy startups, a lot of tech startups, right? And they got great ideas. And so, you pose to them the question of is how can we do this better and more efficient with less pollution, make it cheaper, make it accessible to more people from different incomes, whatever, and then let them loose on it. So I think what you want to do is harness the best of the, I don't know why we call it the free market. Is there anything free? But anyhow, harness the best of that, the entrepreneurial spirit, but give it sideboards and say, go design the best whatever, but without
Uh,
pollution.
that
Or,
that's
you
fair.
know, and
And
so
why
that,
haven't we done that? Did we not know? Did we not care? The Great Pacific Garbage Patch I've known about since I was 9 years old. There's garbage the size of Texas floating in the ocean. We're still polluting. We're creating more than we've ever created. Is it too late? Is it too early? I don't know.
well, in terms of climate, the
In
clock
terms
is
of
ticking.
pollution,
Oh, in terms of pollution,
in
well,
particular, because this is
okay.
more about I mean, yeah, there's these eco or the personal emissions from consumption, but there is this huge problem. Even if I mean, I obviously believe the climate change is happening and we need to act right away, but even if you don't believe that at all, there's still this thousands or billions of pounds of plastic pollution in microplastic all over the world, in the ocean, on our. You go to a different country, you see garbage everywhere. We clean it up here. They don't have the resources to clean it up everywhere. I don't know where I was going with this. Just,
What you said is too late. And I will say the clock is definitely ticking. You've seen the statistics
it's
about
disgusting.
how by 2050, we will have, if we keep on at the current rate we're doing, we'll have more plastic in the ocean than fish. Okay. That is a scary, scary thing because plastic doesn't go away. It degrades into little pieces that look like food to fish, but it doesn't go away. All right. It's built to last, right? So plastics is a problem. And I will just say this, it's made from fossil fuels. And
Right.
as we put pressure on the oil and gas industry to move from, well, and the society to move away from fossil fuels as fuel and move towards electrification, right? And clean energy, the oil and gas industry is like, well, we're going to make money then making plastics. And they have plans to quadruple production of plastics. So that's scary, right? So we're working at multiple levels again to say, hey, wait a minute. If it isn't circular and non-toxic and necessary, let's stop doing it. So, for
Right.
example, we make a lot of things out of plastics, we as a society, that are single use and made to be disposed. So a plastic fork, you go get your takeout, you use it, you throw it all away, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy. These are fossil fuels that took millions of years to create,
It's
and we're
crazy.
using them for 10 minutes and we're throwing them out and they never go away. So they end up in the landfill, or if you're in a country without a waste collection system, they end up in the ocean, in your rivers. That's insane. So yes, we have
It
to stop
really
that. And
is.
so one of the things that we're working on is let's stop making single-use disposable plastics,
Yeah.
stuff that's not necessary. Okay. Turns out you don't really need a straw unless you have a physical disability. You don't really need a straw, or let's make them out of paper. They work just fine. Um,
And
let's
paper's
stop.
recyclable.
Yes. But do you even really need a straw? I mean, the margarita tastes good without a straw. You don't
Mm-hmm.
need a straw, right? So, but yes, if you're going to use a straw, if you need to use a straw, yeah, you can make them out of paper. So we're working with communities to get them to put fees on bags, to um, take to address the single-use disposables. We have a limit here in Colorado in that we are all preempted. There's a preemption clause that the plastic industry put into law that says local communities can't ban plastics. We're trying to get that overturned, but meanwhile, communities are trying to thwart that by putting uh, uh, I was going to say fees on bags and stuff like that. But ultimately, we need to get rid of single-use disposables. So
But
that's
this is
one way we should do it.
that's such a challenging thing to do, though, because as Americans, this whole idea of trying to put restrictions on people and stop them from doing things, people consider restrictions. So I took this whole class in philosophy about positive versus negative freedom. Americans are all about their negative freedom, which is freedom from coercion. So anytime you want to put a restriction on someone, you're going to have to argue with them for 2 hours and then let your thoughts sit. And people don't want restrictions. So how can we effectively communicate that this is in people's best interests? Because specifically Americans are so hesitant to being told they're not allowed to do something. It's like the whole thing the country was founded on. So it's this huge challenge. It's for your best interest, but like you don't want to listen, and it takes time for ideas to sink into people's heads, you know?
Well, okay, so there's a couple things. One is we don't have to tell people they can't have straws. We can tell businesses you're not allowed to use them. But
Yeah,
the other thing is, again, if we said to a company, hey, you are responsible for what you put out into the world, and suddenly they're like, I gotta
I
like
like
deal
that.
with every straw I make, I gotta like go figure out how to deal with it.
That makes
I'm
sense.
gonna quit making straws. I don't really need straws. The world doesn't really need straws. Again, unless you have a disability, you don't really need a straw. So it's putting the responsibility on the right person. It shouldn't be up to
Mm-hmm.
me to figure out what the heck to do with the straw that came with, I didn't even ask for, but here it is in my cup. What do I do with it? I didn't want to be responsible for this. This is not the choice I wanted to make. So anyhow, I think we as a people decide what the sideboards are, and we can call them government regulations, but I think of it more as the people saying, you know what, it's we don't want this stuff in our lives, and we want the companies to take more responsibility for what they're putting on.
I think that's smart.
And you asked if everything gets recycled. I want to say a few words about that,
Please do.
especially when it comes to plastics. There are certain types of plastics that are very toxic to make. Um, Leach into your food, they're not that great. And they're not really recyclable. Styrofoam, polystyrene, that's
Ugh.
one of them. Okay, not good stuff. It'd be great if we could ban that, except for on
It's like
things
little
where you really need
beads,
it.
right?
Yeah, it's bad stuff. And so number 3, number 6, number 7 plastics, we shouldn't be buying them. But even more importantly, we should tell industry, quit making stuff out of them. There
Mm-hmm.
are other resins, 1s, 2s, and 5s, that there are markets for that are reusable, that are less toxic. Okay, to the extent that we need to use those products, let's make them out of 1s, 2s, and 5s, and not 3s, 6s, and 7s. And so that's something, as we run, EcoCycle runs the Boulder County Recycling Center. And so we collect all this stuff in single stream, and then we sort it out and we put it into big bales and we market it on behalf of the county. And there aren't markets for a lot of this stuff anymore because it's crap plastic. And so we're trying to get some consumers not to use it, but we're also participating in dialogues like the U.S. Plastics Pack, which is a big national dialogue with all the big brands, Coca-Cola, etc., Tide. And it's being run by Ellen MacArthur Foundation and World Wildlife Fund. And they have set some pretty ambitious goals, and they're trying to bring everybody together to say, how are we going to make, A, will you sign up for these goals, and B, how do we get there? And they are things like, let's quit using crap plastics, okay? Let's, address these single-use disposables. Let's quit making this stuff. Let's really make the markets work for the kind of plastics, 1s, 2s, and 5s, that stuff like PET bottles. How do we make that really work better so that people don't throw away things that are valuable, technically. So how do we make that work more so that we are capturing all those bottles? And part of it is if those big brands said, okay, we're gonna make sure that every bottle we produce is made out of a minimum recycled content. So there's a market that's pulling, making it all work, right? If there's an end market that wants these things, then they won't get thrown out. So we're a part of these national dialogues to change the system, but with businesses, to get them at the table to shift their model so it's more circular, so it's better for the planet, but in a way that, will work economically as well, and will build their brand, right? When you go buy
Yeah.
something, you want to feel good about what you're buying, right? So you want to support brands that are doing the right thing. So we're working at multiple levels to address what is, a major crisis. Plastics are a big crisis in addition to climate. And again, plastics have a huge climate footprint. They're made out of
Very
fossil
related.
fuels. So all along the production and what you do with them at an end has a huge climate footprint. So these things are all really related. And that's one of the, the big emphasis of our work here at EcoCycle is to get people to think more holistically, and to change the system to be more circular.
Yeah, and I love that, and I appreciate you coming on here. Now, since we're getting kind of towards the end, I just want to do a little transition, which I think kind of is a good way of wrapping up everything we've been talking about, because we're really talking about fundamentally changing the way we live our lives in a very large scale way, the way businesses produce products and the way we consume things. And I saw that you had done, was it a talk or like an article about where in the world happiness is? Was it a talk? And
Oh,
yeah, and the reason I wanted to bring that up is because suicides are at an all-time high, depression's at an all-time high. Everyone's like, this is America, we're doing it, this is the best it's ever been, it's the best country, we're doing everything so amazing, we're the model for the world. But do we really want to measure our society in dollars, or is it more, I'm more a fan of this idea of a human-centered economy where we measure our prosperity and success based on how happy people are, what the standard of living is, what how long the average lifespan is. So all these things we've talked about in ways of changing our society would be more in favor of that. So it's like if everything we're doing is so perfect and amazing right now, why are people so depressed? Why are people so upset? And why are we killing the planet? And now we have so much evidence for it. I just thought you might be cool to touch on that at the end here.
I absolutely agree with you that we should be measuring our progress as a society, as a country, as a community on metrics that get at what really matters.
Love.
And yeah, and equity and justice and sustainability, right? And so how do we do that? And the thing that you were talking about that I was on was Boulder was deemed to be one of the happiest places in the United States. Which is interesting. The United States isn't that happy, just so you know.
Right.
Compared to some other places, maybe even with lower standards of living, where people are more connected to each other, more connected to the planet.
Family.
And I think a big part of what makes people happy is leading meaningful lives, doing meaningful work
100%.
that has integrity to it, right? And so one of the reasons that we were arguing that Boulder was more happy is there's a lot of people here engaged in work to try to address big problems like climate and sustainability, and to figure out new models. And that there's a lot of meaning there. It doesn't mean everybody's like, hey, everything's fine, because everything is not fine. No. But working together to solve these problems and to change the systems and to include people in those discussions, like that is very satisfying, and leads to happiness at some level. So that's what I guess I would leave us with a call to action is, yeah, we need to all be paying more attention to our own choices, but we also need to be working together to change the systems. And we're a democracy, and democracy is driven by people making their case made for what they want and making the change happen. And regardless of who's in the White House, we need to lead. And
Right.
certainly that's become clear as our national leadership isn't really happening right now. We need to come up with the solutions. We need to make them happen. We need to make the system reflect our values. And so I invite everyone to get engaged in that. I think it's really awesome that you are provoking these really in-depth conversations about how we can do that. And there's a
Thank you.
lot of ways to get involved. I invite people to get involved with EcoCycle, but there's lots of other groups doing really great work as well. And finding a place to get your shoulder into the wheel and to help with solutions, I think, is really important, and ultimately is also very meaningful.
Yeah, and you're spending time with people who care about things, and you'll care about each other. And I think life is all about working well with others to make sure other people succeed. And I think that's really great. Well, Suzanne, I think I can't even say we scratched the surface today. I think we barely got anything into this. So I'd love to have you come back on and talk, or I'd love to talk with Judy about EcoCycle at some point. But either way, it's been a real pleasure
Anytime.
to yeah, it's been a real pleasure to have you. I appreciate you coming on. And I hope everybody has a fantastic day and can look forward to another episode as this show continues on for years to come, because we're never going to run out of things to talk about, and we can always keep improving and keep getting better. So this was Changing the Climate. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate you listening. Take it easy.